Hey, okay, so with this addition to the poetry ladder framework that I've been building lately, I wanted to talk about the process of writing poetry and how for each stage of development there is a different process behind it. This idea actually came out of a conversation with a colleague, um, so credit to him. And what I tried to come up with is I think obviously each stage of development is going to, because they are very broad stages of development, they are going to have lots of different processes. I'm not trying to imply that there is only ever one process for creating art. Each text is going to be created not just with a different process, but like could be created over time with lots of different processes, or even in a single act of creating, there can be multiple processes going on at once. So I'm not trying to do anything reductive. What I'm trying to create is a bit of a map for how that indicates just roughly the terrain that's possible, and the differences between the stages. So that's the aim. Let's get into it. So for the sentimental stage, what we have, and I'll go through all of these. I've got a slide for each of these types of processes, and I'll go into each of them in depth. First, we have purging at the sentimental stage. We have perfecting at the scholarly stage, precipitating at the sensing stage, and presenting at the scrying stage. So for purging, why did I choose this? Because I wanted to capture the the selfie snapshot kind of approach to, let's say, Instagram poetry that's out there. It's designed to be cathartic for the poet. It's akin to, and really not that at all dissimilar from, journaling. When you look at the etymology of purging, this becomes clearer. So this was just a quick search on etymology.com. Directly from Latin purgare, cleanse or make clean, purify, especially in reference to the bodies, to free from what is superfluous, remove or clear away, to set in motion, to drive or draw out or forth, to move. So what I think this really clearly shows is that essentially it's facilitating it's because it's closer to the masses and to this kind of materialistic culture at this stage of development, which is why Instagram poetry is the most read poetry currently. What it's doing is essentially, I'm going to draw a bit of an analogy. It is basically a bodily function that is kind of being facilitated. To free from what is superfluous, I think, captures this when there's a build-up of excuse the metaphor, but like pus or anything else we need to remove from our system. It's essentially superfluous. It's not what our system needs or can't hold on to for long, and it's just moving it out of our system. and so that's what I'm trying to capture with purging. Pretty straightforward, and I've got this little diagram of the circle because I'm trying to show that the poet is or the artist is the circle, and then there's like this build-up of excrement or whatever you want to call it, or of emotion in this case, because that's the material that the sentimental type is working with primarily. It's a build-up of it, and then it needs to be removed. Okay. The next stage is perfecting. So at this stage, this is for the scholars. The scholarly type is, as you recall, primarily concerned with creating art that is formally polished and traditional, both in form and content. What the meaning, the etymology of perfect, per is through or completely, and facere is to make or to do. I've underlined make because I think that actually captures it quite well. It is the completion of a crafted object, like a craftsman working on a vase or some kind of ceramic, some kind of object. The word poetry comes from poesis, which has a confusing etymology, or confusing, maybe I should say complex etymology, and it can be interpreted to mean deeper things and more superficial things, but what it's typically taken to mean is making, a kind of craftsman-like making of something, like a vase. And so that's what I think this stage tends to use a lot of metaphors. So just like in purging, they are using a lot of therapeutic metaphors to describe the process, typically. Poets and artists at the scholarly stage tend to use a lot of craft or workman-like metaphors. That's how they discuss it, the process, which I think corresponds to what George Saunders, quite a well-known short story writer, calls the pre-concept. And he thinks that a lot of writers currently start from a pre-concept, some kind of idea about how the world works or about humans operate, about who humans are, that limits their art and keeps it pretty superficial. So this is, and that's, when you get political writing and there's a very obvious lack of depth in their characterization of people who might oppose their views. That's sort of the stereotype, but I'm going to kind of slightly alter what he means by pre-concept to just simply mean that there's some kind of a blueprint for the commissioned work. So I tried to show this with two diagrams. The first is just, it's like a puzzle piece. It's working with forms to complete the form. Or, and unfortunately my video is, I think, over the top of the circle. It's two black circles. They're the one on the left representing the poet, and the one on the right representing the text, and they're treated as completely distinct things. And that, to me, is what is implied in this way of looking at the process of creation, of artistic creation. Is this a very clear, simple distinction between creator and the created object? Just like in a craftsman or a carpenter, they don't have a complex way of viewing the thing they're creating. It is being done according to a blueprint. It's distinct from them. There's not really a deeper meaning to it. So that's perfecting. That's what I'm trying to capture there, that separation. Now we get into precipitation, which I think is where we start moving into more of a direct relationship with what's coming through. Even that metaphor, coming through, that implies something more dynamic and living than a blueprint that's already fixed. So interestingly enough, I did not intend this, but precipitation comes from an alchemical term, which seems appropriate, meaning the separation of a solid substance from a solution. And I think that I saw that and I was like, that's exactly what I'm trying to get at. Precipitation, like a cloud condensing into a droplet. It starts with a cloud, which is a big thing. It's bigger than a human being. Condenses into a drop, which is the text that comes through. So there's so much to say here, but I think I'll try to just keep it pretty linear. Keats's quote, he has this really famous quote about poetry, about how it should come as naturally as leaves to a tree or not at all, which I really like because that was one of the only places I've seen a poet actually articulate this process. Because naturally as leaves to a tree, yeah, you could also change that to say should come as naturally as droplets out of a cloud. It's the same process of this natural law of fruition. And Geoffrey Hill and Ezra Pound, they both wrote about the magnet behind the creative process, gathering the various iron filings into a pattern. So what I think is when poets and artists start talking about the mystery of the creative process or some sort of underlining or overarching organizing force or principle behind the process, they're usually talking about this stage of development. I know I've referred to both Geoffrey Hill and Ezra Pound as scholarly poets, but that just proves the point that I began this presentation with, which is that poets and artists, with their process, some of the other things I've been able to do in this framework are maybe more clear to delineate, but when it comes to process, I think there is a bit of overlap and simultaneity to them. Again, I'm just trying to, but I still think it's useful to talk about them because they do indicate these broad differences. Okay, so at this point, I mean, I've left it pretty open. Precipitation could still be taken to be quite a general thing, or it could be taken to mean what F.R. Leavis criticised Shelley for, as just simply suspending one's critical faculties. And he wrote in an essay, I can't remember exactly where it's from. If I remember, I'll add it into the PowerPoint or the notes under the video. But he wrote this essay basically saying that Shelley thought that poetry was basically just suspending your critical thinking and just being associative in your thinking, and that as a result his poetry is either sentimental or derivative. Because if you suspend your critical thinking, then you might, if you've been reading a lot of Shakespeare, you're going to produce a lot of Shakespearean language. And so I thought that was quite an instructive example of how what I'm talking about could be misunderstood. I'm not saying the suspending of critical faculties. And I think a scholar like F.R. Leavis, at the scholarly stage of development, he is going to be very sceptical of anything that could be above his mode of engagement. So to help clarify why what I actually am advocating for, we can understand he was a biologist and a polymath, Michael Polanyi, who had this concept of, he studied epistemology and how we come to know things. And it's quite a deep idea, the idea of focal subsidiary integration, which is just the notion that prior to knowing something, we get a sense of it first. We get a sense of it first, and then we come to gradually clarify it through a process of becoming, which I mean I could put it in a lot more of a complex and scientifically and use the scientific terminology that he uses, but I think that's pretty much, I don't want to overcomplicate it. We sense something first, which is larger than us, that we're not sure about. We haven't fully understood it. We don't know it yet. But it gives us something to kind of aim towards, and then we try, is it like this? Over time, whether this is learning golf or learning a concept, we go, is it like this? And then we get a sense. We're like, no, that's not exactly what I'm sensing. And so then we correct and we get a little bit closer and we get that feedback somehow because we've got that sense. We're like, yeah, that maps on a little bit more. And we keep doing that until we know it. And so there's always this prior knowing that comes through sensing. But that means that there is what's called a strange attractor. Strange attractor is a pole that organizes a field, but the pole, a system, any system in nature, but it's not a fixed thing. It's a pole, it's an organizing principle that is itself kind of dynamic. I know that's really complex. What I'm trying to say is there's a distinction between an organizing principle that's a fixed pole, which is like a pre-concept, and one that is more of this larger kind of field or essence. And we sense that essence, and we come into proximity and into knowing it and being it in the process of creating it, and that's the process of precipitation. So we sense the essence, then we know and we become it, and then we express it almost as the field, because it's almost the field or the cloud itself expressing through you. And that sort of uses all of our critical faculties, really. Not in a way that interrupts it either, but it's like it's like the magnet that organizes the iron filings, and so it's a much deeper, larger thing. So I tried to show that what I'm talking about with this diagram. We have the essence on the left, which we sense, then it expands. That we have that sense of it expands in us until we express it, and it comes out through us into expression. What I'm trying to show is that there isn't that same separation between text and creator, or the impulse, the thing that's been created and the creator, because we actually become it. We become what we're expressing. It moves through us. It's larger than us, and we know it through our being, and that's what we're intending to impart to our readers. And that's why at this stage of development the purpose is appropriation, whereas at the scholarly stage it's appreciation of the perfected object, just like you appreciate a well-made vase, but you don't appropriate it into your being. And this just reminds me of Wordsworth's poems. I don't know how you can read Tintern Abbey and not see that what he's trying to do is impart something which we can sense and be nourished by. But moving on. So that's precipitating. Presenting. So this one is, the most removed from us, obviously. And it's not... This is my sense of it. It's not something I know through experience. Why have I used presenting? Because that seems like a much more mundane term than precipitating. Shouldn't it be something alchemical and obscure? But I think what I'm trying to capture is I'm trying to keep it pretty simple. They have a vision of something, and then they are trying to essentially transcribe it and then just present it to us. Present, for me, like the way I understand the etymology of that is that there's something that they have arrived at before us that they are giving to us. It's not the pre-concept that the craftsman has, it's a vision, and there seems to be a very large distinction between the two. What is the distinction? The distinction between a map and a territory, I suppose, in a way. In terms of the density of reality in it. And I'm just going to leave it at that. I think there's... Yeah, I will leave it at that. So what's the movement across these 4 stages? We've got separated to inhabiting, and we've got... Actually, just before I do this, I do actually just want to make one more point about the presenting. Blake and Shakespeare and Dante, and Goethe, they had a vision of something. They had a vision and they presented it to us. It's clear. I mean, they talk about that. Not Shakespeare, whom we know little about, but Dante talks about how he had a vision, and this is what he's giving to us. Goethe clearly saw and understood things with his Faust. Blake talks about... He literally calls it... what does he call it? Writing down the dictates of spirits. They see something and then they present it to us. That seems to me to be quite a distinct thing from sensing the previous stage. And again, it's not something that I have experience with, but I can recognize that there's a distinction there that we need to come to eventually understand. Okay, so now moving on to the movement, the overall sequence. So we move from separated to inhabiting. Because if you recall the initial 2 separated circles of the scholarly stage, there is implied in that there's like this circle of the poet and the circle of the text, and there's a separation between the two. It seems... How do I put this? There's just something in it that implies a strange kind of completion in the artist themselves. If they can produce something as they believe that is formally polished and perfected, that's the process of perfecting, then they don't need to alter their being in any way, and they don't in the process of writing it. I'm glad I articulated that, because that's what I'm trying to get at there. And whereas inhabiting seems to be a more dynamic contact with something living and real, and contact it's more dynamic, and we and fluid. Yeah. Okay, so then that's what I mean by separated to inhabiting. Yeah. Inhabiting as in being, like moving our being, so that, or I mean, we have to use these metaphors of movement. We move our being into the essence, or the essence moves into our being. It's not the same thing as the separated approach. There's discrete to holistic, so we're moving from small blueprint, small patterns, to larger patterns, larger wholes than us, wholes that are larger than us. Move from something that is focused on the self, what the self can see and do, to allowing something else to come through. And I would say from relatively unorganized to increasing amounts of organized and order. I've already made these concessions that there are types of processes, and each stage will have others, and that artists and poets can move across these processes, sometimes even doing them simultaneously, because you can be trying to perfect something and then, without the poet even really knowing, or the artist, something larger starts to come through and organize their work. And they talk about that. Those are the poems or the experiences that artists have that they talk about. They talk about how it felt like something else was kind of doing the writing for them. I suppose the distinction is between artists who do that as a matter of course, and artists that do that almost by accident, rarely. And I would say that it is when they start doing that as a matter of course, like that is the modus operandi of their poetry. That's when they move into the sensing stage. So a lot to sort of capture here. We'll see, where it goes from here, if it does. I think that this captures quite a lot about the differences between these approaches. So thank you for listening. And we'll see where it goes from here. Just actually a quick postscript, because I just had this thought that I had while I was giving the presentation that I forgot or didn't get to, just about Joyce. So when I'm talking about the last stage, presenting, and I spoke about Dante, Blake, Shakespeare, Goethe, I know that Joyce was deliberately intending his work to be among those ranks. And I guess I just wanted to share, in light of this framework, what I think is going on there. Maybe I'm right, and maybe this is useful. We'll see. But it seems like he was at the scholarly stage, and that what he was producing was a scholarly understanding and representation of wisdom poetry. and of the final stage. Because his vision, to me, like even in Ulysses, if you're mapping present day time onto a mythic cycle, seems too constructed for me. It doesn't seem born out of a real vision. And I mean, there's his very famous quote about him writing for academics, so wanting to keep them busy, which I think kind of betrays the level he's at. Really, he's not writing like the other, like Shakespeare, Blake, Dante, Goethe, to impart wisdom. He's writing to be appreciated, which is the stage of, which is, as I say, the purpose of poetry or art for the scholarly type. So, and I think that's even the case in Finnegan's Wake, which I know is definitely deep, and that's why I think Joyce is an interesting thing to maybe end this on, because he does do some very strange things for a scholarly type that would seem to touch on much larger essences or vision. And I do think that he touches on things that pertains to those stages of development. But I think the primary sort of stage that he's at is a scholarly, with some flirting with these other stages, processes. So, yeah, I will leave it there. And again, thanks for listening. Yeah, okay, so I've been thinking, I'm going to add a postscript here. I think there's a couple of points I want to make. One is that I think, Joyce is actually probably a prototypical kind of instance of the craftsman, because he literally did work off a blueprint. He created a blueprint, which he then later sent to critics, sort of laying out the schema for each chapter. So it's interesting that what I'm talking about seems to map so neatly onto Joyce. Having said that, that's my first point. My second point is that I don't want to imply that scholars always work off a blueprint. What I do want to imply is that because that blueprint might not be completely explicit to them, and they probably, to them, writing poetry, creating art, is kind of experienced as an exploration. From the outside, though, looking at the kind of art that they create, let's say a Christian poet, it's clear that they are creating, responding to, with enclosed within a pretty fixed system. So what's going on there? I think that this is the distinction, this is my third point, there's a distinction between, as I was saying in one of the earlier slides, between a strange attractor and a fixed pole. Which is, I guess, what I'm trying to say. It really just boils down to, are they responding to something that is living and real, or are they responding to something that is dead and fixed and static and old? And this is always going to be a really contentious notion, because, of course, what's living and real seems to be fairly, at least at first glance, pretty relative. You're going to get like scholars responding to, let's say, something that's like a Christian framework. To a censor, that's going to seem relatively dead next to what they're trying to bring through, which is like something, a living connection to something real and present. And compared to maybe, say, just personal emotions, what the scholar is trying to articulate with their, let's say, Christian poetry is going to be comparatively probably more living and real. And so there's this kind of baked in relativity here. And I think we have to kind of account for that apparent relativity and balance it with the fact of some kind of vertical sequence here, which is the whole point of this whole ladder of poetry. Because I think what Shakespeare's doing is connected to something more living and real. It's 400 years later than what Christian poets, run-of-the-mill Christian poet, is going to be expressing. And I think we need to take that into account. So, again, I'll leave that there. And we'll see if that links to anything. But I think that wraps it up for now. Okay, so I do have some additional thoughts here that I wanted to share just around drafting, because I realised I hadn't really spoken about that, and that probably grounds this part of the framework that I've been building in this presentation in something practical. So I think, at the initial stage, purging for the sentimental types, I don't think there is much drafting that goes on really at this stage. It's really only when you get to the the perfecting stage, which is implicit in the term perfecting, and that's where you get that workman-like approach to iteration and ensuring that the work fits the blueprint in the best possible way and updating the blueprint as you go. All of that is, I think, typical of the perfecting process of the scholarly stage of development. That, to me, is where, if you look online, you'll see people kind of oscillating between this kind of no drafting approach, where, as expressed, Jack Kerouac expresses it quite well when he says first thought, best thought. And so you get people in poetry circles either talking about that approach, which is the sentimental stage, or this kind of Iowa workshop approach to drafting and iterating everything. And I guess I'm talking right now more specifically about poetry, because prose is a different kind of thing altogether, I think, because it is a longer form and there has to be some kind of I think iteration there, just to make sure it all flows seamlessly. Although, it's on a continuum with poetry. I don't want to make any hard and fast rules or distinctions between prose and poetry. What I'm saying here can still apply to prose writers, but it maybe doesn't apply as much. Then you get to the precipitating stage, where I think one doesn't really draft in the same way, because it's not a blueprint that you're writing from. It's a precipitation, so it's a natural process of condensation, like droplets from a cloud. And as Keats said, should come as naturally as leaves to a tree. It's not about drafting. It's about participating in the natural process of the organic development of the poem. And that really, I think that rarely involves any kind of drafting. I think if a poet at this level were to rewrite a poem, they wouldn't rewrite it from with a focus on form, because again, that's the aesthetic, ethical material that the scholarly stage is working on. The censor is working more with essence, and so to rewrite a poem, they would actually have to sort of like undergo the process of condensing the essence, and that's precipitating the essence, and that would be a rare thing to do. Conceivable, can happen, but it would probably only happen if the essence itself was, or like if the initial process of precipitation was somehow interrupted, and it wasn't able to fully come through. And then you've got the presenting. As I believe it was Johnson who said quite famously of Shakespeare that he never blotted a line, meaning that Shakespeare never rewrote his lines. And I think the same could be said of Blake, who wrote by dictate. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was something similar for Dante. And I'd be curious to hear about Goethe's process with drafting, and if there was much drafting of Faust, but as a general rule, it's, I would say, not quite. Like, that's not really a part of that process, because you are you've seen something, you're then recording. So that's, or presenting. So I think, I know this is the third additional or addendum that I've made to this PowerPoint. I think that should be it. So is there anything else to bring up in connection to this? Just that I think this is an important piece of the puzzle. It is worth bringing in, because there is, if you look at poetry groups online, the poetry establishment, as I've already said numerous times, is made up by the scholarly stage of development, which does just take for granted that one is supposed to draft and craft a poem, labour at crafting a poem, and what I'm trying to indicate here is that there is actually a higher stage of development, and it is very easy for the precipitating process to be confused with and judged as the purging stage, or as just this kind of formless, careless act of purging emotions, and that really what censors need is to pursue more craft, and that I think that's a really big mistake, because I think that just like the multiple drafting process at the second stage is more complex than the first stage, so too I think is the process of precipitation more complex than the process of the second stage, which is perfecting, because it's more of a natural law rather than a simple separated crafting of an external object. So there's more going on in it, in the precipitating. And maybe I will finish up just by mentioning Yeats, who wrote that difficulty is the poet's plough, and it helps. I'm now paraphrasing. It helps the poet, like difficulty, like with rhyme sequences, particular forms, particular kind of meters. That all of the aspects of craft should be what helps the poet constrain the poet and help them get deeper into the thing that they're trying to talk about, which I think is Yeats channeling the scholar. And it is possible that, Yeats did write that in a letter, and I would be curious to see who he wrote it to. I know it was another poet of some kind that whose work he was reviewing, a lady. And I would be interested to see if that Yeats was actually talking to someone he thought, not using obviously the language we've got here, but if he thought that she was at the sentimental stage and what she needs to move towards is something like more of a disciplined approach to craft. But I would say that there is, and if that theory isn't the case, then we have to go with another theory, which is just that in Yeats, as in Geoffrey Hill, there are two parts of him. There's the scholar and the censor, and they have different modes, which I think is in itself quite interesting to note and observe. And yeah, so I think we'll leave it there.